good reminder of God's grace to us. Well, good morning. Some of you know I used to serve a church in Thurmont, Maryland, and back in the 90s, back in the old days. And when I first got to Thurmont, it was the summer. I moved in July, and I went to the local ministerium meeting where the clergy were gathering. And one of the hot topics, one of the agenda items was what they were going to do about the KKK that was coming to town in a couple months. Every year in Thurmont, up until the 90s, the KKK, local KKK in that area, would bus members of the KKK into Thurmont, into downtown Thurmont, if you've ever been to Thurmont, downtown Thurmont, Main Street, and they would exit the bus and they would go out into the community. They would hand out pamphlets about their organization to recruit new members. And this happened every Labor Day, Monday, every year for years. And so the clergy were like, what are we going to do? And, we debated and we talked about it and say, how are we going to do this? And there were some of us who wanted to show up and get in their face and confront them in the middle of town square. And then some of us thought about, well, we'll stand around them and we'll hold signs to counter messages. We thought about all these different ways to challenge the problem of hate. And as we kept discussing it and talking about it, we came to a unified conclusion. We as clergy said, you can't counter hate with more hate. Hate is not going to solve hate. Being hateful is not going to get rid of other people being haters. And I have this very temptation to quote Taylor Swift right now, but I'm not. But part of what you do is you confront hate with love. And so we thought, how do we do that? So we actually decided not to confront the KKK. What we decided to do, instead of being confrontational, we decided to be countercultural. And so we planned another event called Thurmont United that would take place just a couple blocks down from downtown Thurmont. And we would have food, we would have music, we would have people speak, and we would unify the community. We would bring the community together and say, we're all unified. We welcome people of all backgrounds into our community. And so we held this rally, this counter-cultural rally to what the KKK was doing. And we had about 500 people show up. The only thing we did was we made sure that it was at the same time that the KKK came to town. And sure enough, as we were holding our rally, we could see the bus of KKK members come into town and drive right through town, and they didn't stop, they just kept on going. Because when they saw what we were doing, they say, okay, this community is changing, this community is different. We're not welcome here anymore. They got that message. They left town, and they never came back again. So that's good news. But it's in the context of that environment that I met a gentleman from Howard University, an African-American man. His name was Mike, who was doing research on racism. This is 20 years ago. He was doing a project on racism in America. And he relayed the story to us, to several of us, that what he was doing was that he was going and having dinner with the Grand Dragon of the KKK as a part of his research. He was actually going into the home of the Grand Dragon that lived just outside of Thurmont in a little town called Rocky Ridge. And he lived there, and this gentleman, if you can imagine, this African-American gentleman was going to the Grand Dragon's home, sitting down at the dinner table with him and his family, and asking questions about why he believed what he believed. He didn't go in there with an agenda. He didn't go in there to tell him how wrong he was. He went in there to listen and to learn. But through the course of doing multiple dinners, not just one, he developed a relationship with the Grand Dragon of the KKK. How many of us would do that? How many of us would go sit at a dinner table with someone we hate or hates us? How many of us would actually take the risk of going and having a conversation, not to get our agenda across, but to listen to the other person. Anybody want to take us up on that? Now you know how Jonah felt. You know exactly how Jonah felt. Because Jonah wasn't willing to go be in Nineveh because he despised the Ninevites. He hated the city of Nineveh. He hated the people of Nineveh, and he did not want to go preach God's message to them because he was afraid God would show them mercy. And he didn't want mercy for his enemies. He didn't want mercy for the people he hated. He wanted to just keep on hating. Haters gonna hate, hate, hate. I just couldn't resist. Sorry, But so what Jonah was doing was he said, I am not going to do what you're asking me to do, God. I'm not going to do this hard thing that you're asking me to do. I'm going to run away. In fact, we find in chapter 1 of Jonah, it says, but Jonah got up and went in the opposite direction in order to get away from the Lord. Like God is geographically limited, like he can get up and go. And we all know that. We kind of chuckle that in our understanding of God, we know you can't get away from God, but in his mind, he's thinking, all right, if God's speaking to me here, I've got to get as far away from here and as far away from Nineveh as I possibly can. So he gets on a ship to Tarshish, which is twice the distance away from where his relationship to Nineveh. That's all the way across the Mediterranean Sea from Israel. So he's getting as far away as he can possibly think and go from, and he thinks that, all right, if I could just get away from this place, God will stop speaking to me. If I can just get to Tarshish, I will get away from what God is asking me to do. So he gets on this ship, he's running away, and we everybody kind of chuckled, because we say, how do you run away from God, right? I would suggest that we do too. We just don't do it geographically. We've found more sophisticated ways to do it. It's called a Google Calendar. And we fill it up, right? And then when God comes to us and says, hey, go to Nineveh or go do something risky or hard, we go, God, I'd love to help you out, but, look at my calendar, God. I'm just too busy for you. I got too many other plans. I'm overcommitted already. I don't have time to change my travel itinerary. I've got to go, I don't have time to change my calendar. I got too many commitments. And so we think, we use our calendars and our busyness as an excuse to not listen to God. Or sometimes we can't even hear God, what God is asking us to do, because we're so busy and distracted by our busyness that we can't actually hear what God might be saying to us. And that's part of the reason we're dirt poor. That's the reason we're not hearing from God, is because spiritually we're dirt poor. Our souls are shriveling and shrinking up because of our busyness, and we can no longer hear God. And so we think, how am I going to ever hear God in my busyness? So it's part of our spiritual poverty. So it's interesting because, if you ever try and run away from God or run away from what God's asking you to do or me to do, you know what God does? God doesn't take no for an answer. Just the very next verse, it says, suddenly the Lord flung a powerful wind over the sea, causing a violent storm that threatened to send them all to the bottom. And I think about this. Now, in our sophisticated way of 21st century thinking, we don't like to think of this idea that God would cause a storm. But you have to remember, Jonah's writing in hindsight. He's looking back at this storm in his life, and he's going, God used that storm to redirect me. God uses this storm on the sea to get me back in the right direction. And you and I can definitely identify with circumstances of life that get us to turn back to God. Or get us circumstances of life that get us back to orienting our lives back to God. There are things that just knock us off our calendars. Those storms that come and all of a sudden those storms don't fit into your calendar, don't fit into your agenda, don't fit into what you were planning to do. And all of a sudden you're having to reorder life. You're having to rethink your calendar. You're having to rethink what life is all about because this storm, this circumstance has impacted your life. And that's where Jonah is. The storm has come, and so the guys on deck, they're freaking out. The storm is raging. The guys, the sailors, they're all upset. They're like wondering what's going on. So they all begin to pray to their gods, all their different gods. Jonah, meanwhile, is not praying. He's sleeping. He's down in the hold of the ship and he's sleeping. He doesn't even want to talk to God. You ever been in a moment where you don't want to talk to God? Because you know if you talk to God, you know what God's going to say to you, and so you don't want to listen, and so you just don't talk to God, right? Maybe it's easier to relate to your parents. You know what your parents are going to say, so you don't say anything to your parents. Remember doing that growing up? Well, I'm not going to say anything to my parents because if I say something, I know exactly what they're going to say, so I'm just not going to say anything. I'm going to avoid talking to them. Jonah is avoiding talking to God while all the other sailors are talking to God, their gods. Finally, they decide, let's cast lots, which was a way of discerning what was going on, trying to understand why they were in this storm. And so they cast lots, and the lot falls to Jonah. So they go down, and they wake Jonah up. And they go, Jonah, what have you done? And he said, well, I'm running away from God. And they're like, oh, you God, come on. Even the pagans understand you don't run away from God. They get it. Jonah, they're like, you're the reason. So he says to them, so Jonah says to the sailors, he says, throw me into the sea. And of course their reaction is, we're not going to do that. We're not going to throw you. That would be like, you would die. So they're very reluctant to do it, but Jonah assures them, hey, I'm telling you, if you throw me in the sea, this storm will go away. I know God. I'm just running away from God. See, it's possible to know God and run away from God. It's possible to believe in God and have faith in God and all these wonderful things and still be running away from God, and that's exactly where Jonah is. So they reluctantly throw Jonah overboard, and the storm begins to subside. So not only has Jonah been running from God, but now he's just given up. This is resignation, folks. He's like, well, if I'm in the sea and I die, God can't make me do anything then. He's basically just given up on life. He has given up. He was running, and now he's just resigned himself to whatever's going to happen in the sea. And this is the moment where Jonah is dirt poor. This is the moment where Jonah is dirt poor spiritually, because he's running as far away from God, ignoring God, avoiding God, and now he's just basically given up on life. If you came here today and you've been running from God, I got good news for you. If you came today and you feel like you're just throwing in the towel on something, I got good news for you today. Because as we learned last week, Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. If you came running or resigning and you're poor in spirit, good news, the kingdom of heaven is yours today. And it's because it's in that moment of spiritual poverty that we open ourselves back up to God. And God can begin to work in our lives. And that's exactly what happens to Jonah. God sends this great fish. It says in the passage, it could have been a whale. In the Mediterranean, most likely candidate would have been a sperm whale, which swallows its prey whole. And so this whale would have possibly swallowed Jonah, and he finds himself in this great fish. Travel plans have been canceled. Calendar has been cleared. There is no cell phone reception here. Could you see Jonah in there? I can't get a signal, But in this place, in this dark place, there are two things. Basically, silence and solitude. That in this dark place that Jonah finds himself, he is experiencing silence and solitude. All the distractions are stripped away from him. He has nothing to do but talk to God. God has stripped away everything else so that he could talk to God. And that's what we heard this morning from the scripture reading. His prayer, his conversation with God. The conversation he's been avoiding this whole time is the conversation he has in chapter 2 of Jonah. And he knew that if he talked to God, he would turn his life back to God, and he does. That prayer was a prayer of recommitment. It was a prayer of renewal. It was a prayer saying to God, God, I'm back on board with your agenda. I know it took a storm. I know it took a whale, but I'm back on board now. You've convinced me. I needed this dark place to see my spiritual poverty, and that's exactly what that prayer reveals, so that I will turn my life back to you, and I will be blessed to receive the kingdom of heaven, God's grace for me, God's mercy for me, God's purpose for me. You know, I experienced that myself a few years ago. Some of you know that I took renewal leave, sabbatical leave, back in 2014, and I had come to a place in ministry where everything was going great here at church. Ministry was going well. My family was well. Everything is good. But I was busy. You know, I was I would say I was overextended. And in the midst of my busyness, I began to realize that this busyness was actually eating away at my soul. And I was experiencing some of my own spiritual poverty even as a pastor, because you can be busy and faithful and not experience a good relationship with God. Yeah, that can be neglected in the busyness, which is, I assume, not only applies to pastors, but applies to all of us. So I said, I need to take some time off from, and the church was gracious enough to allow me that time off, support my family during that time. And so the first thing I did, as some of you know, I went to a monastery for a week. And it was a week of silence. Nobody talked to me, and I wasn't allowed to talk to anybody else. And so I had this space of silence for a week. How many people think you could do a whole week of silence? Yeah. Some of you are like, yes, please, let me go. And others, you're like, no way, I could never handle it, right? The introverts and the extroverts in the room are having a debate right now. All right. So I went into the silence. But the other thing is they gave me they put everybody in a single room, like a cell. It's got a bed and a desk and very Spartan. I did bring my Bible. Somebody asked me that early service. Yeah, there's a Bible there. So I thought about that, and so I had this solitude, silence and solitude. And as I entered into this, what seemed to me to be a dark place, God began to speak. How many days, from you, those of you who take Sunday, do you remember how many days Jonah was in the dark place, the belly of the whale? 3 days, right. I will tell you that after 3 days, it was on day 3 of my silence and solitude that I felt like God began to speak to me again. Not on day 1, not on day 2. It was like day 3. I had to get stripped down. Matt had to get stripped down enough, pulled away from all the distractions of life to get to the place where God could say, okay, Matt, I got you right where I want you. Let me share a few things with you about your purpose. Let me share a few things about you, about what's getting in your way of your relationship with me. It didn't happen until day 3. Sometimes it takes silence and solitude for us to hear clearly from God, or to reorient our lives back to God and figure out what our purpose is and why God has us here. I don't know what your purpose is today, but I do know that God has a purpose for you. But the thing about that is that Nineveh, for Jonah, was the place that God wanted him to go to the people he hated. What's your Nineveh? What's your Nineveh? What's that hard place that God is calling you to, that God is asking you to go to, that you're avoiding? What is that hard place that you don't actually want to talk to God about, because you know if you talk to God about it, God's going to ask you to go to Nineveh? What are you running from? What is God asking you to do? You see, the hard thing for Jonah was to think that God might actually love the people he hated. That God might actually extend mercy and grace to the people he hated. it was so much easier to hate than it was to love. And yet Jonah was being called to go take God's mercy and message and grace to his Nineveh, to the people of Nineveh. What is your Nineveh? What is that hard thing God is asking you to do in your life? Well, I can tell you this. If we learn anything from Jonah today, we learn this. You can run, but you can't hide. Amen. You know, I have this bad habit of forgetting to tell the end of the story. I didn't finish a story today. I don't know if you knew that. I didn't tell you what happened with Mike and the Grand Dragon. The man, after being Grand Dragon for many years, the next year, after spending time with Mike, stepped down from leadership. And I heard through the rumor mill later that he actually left the KKK. Now, I don't know if he changed his beliefs, but I have to think that Mike's relationship with him made a difference. I have to believe that because he got to know somebody on the other side of the line from him, the other side of the aisle from him, that he began to soften his heart. You really want to change the world? Go to Nineveh and know that God goes with you. Amen.